Hello and welcome to our special encore live performance of this Saving Private Ryan and IHL Lessons on the Law of Armed Conflict presentation. I'm Thomas Harper, Senior Counsel in International Humanitarian Law for the American Red Cross. And on behalf of our entire national headquarters IHL program and team here in Washington, D.C., I want to thank you for taking time out of your day to spend with us talking about one of my absolute favorite movies of all time, Saving Private Ryan, and how it can better help us understand IHL, the law of armed conflict. I want to preface this. I don't always do this, but because we're talking about a pretty graphic war movie, something that depicts war in realistic terms, I do want to offer viewer discretion. Not that any little kids are watching a webinar on an evening like tonight. We're on YouTube after the fact, but just be aware we're not going to shy away from some of the sort of more heady themes in the movie. We also will look at a couple clips that involve adult themes and a little bit of gore. And so I just want to offer that viewer discretion before we move forward. Also, if you haven't seen Saving Private Ryan, I hope that you're motivated to after this presentation. Understand it's not a prerequisite. You don't need to be a longtime fan of the movie to understand what's going on. We'll lead you through any kind of plot points that are necessary to understand the analysis that's at issue. But just be aware that there are spoilers for some pretty important plot points in the movie that we'll cover during our analysis today. So with that, I do want to acknowledge that the most egregious proverbial war crime that was committed in relation to Saving Private Ryan was at the Academy Awards in 1999, so awarding 1998 films awards. And that was when Saving Private Ryan lost the Best Picture nomination or the Best Picture award to Shakespeare in Love. No shade on that movie. Gwyneth Paltrow and her cast there, I'm sure were outstanding. Fine movie in its own regard, but come on, Academy, what were you thinking? I want to encourage you as we go through this entire presentation, please share in the chat, be active, tell us where you're tuning in from. We always get folks tuning in from coast to coast and many other countries around the world. That's the real joy in doing these dissemination presentations, is being able to bring together a group like yourselves. If you're watching this on YouTube, leave a comment about your favorite scene, your thoughts on the analysis here. There aren't necessarily always right answers to the things that we discuss, and that's what makes it really fun. Unfortunately, I don't have the ability to see the chat, so I'm not going to be able to interact with questions. We may run out of time, and I can't promise that we'll have a Q&A, a proper Q&A at the end, but I will leave you some resources before we tune out that will allow you to get in touch with us. Your mics are muted, your video cameras are off for this webinar, so don't worry about that. But please use those emoji functions on Zoom to share your reactions as we go through. So I want to set the scene, and this is as much to bring everybody onto the same sheet of music as it is for folks that who maybe haven't seen Saving Private Ryan. But the setting for this movie is D-Day and the days that follow the invasion of Normandy. So the invasion happens and the movie starts on the 6th of June in 1944. And for those that are geographically challenged, maybe map challenged like myself, what we're talking about is the western coast of France, and it's pictured here. So you've got the English Channel running down the middle there between Great Britain and France, and circled in red there toward the bottom of the screen is the area in which the movie takes place, and in fact, maybe a little bit further inland in France. But this portion of beach in Normandy is where these landings happen. And to draw us in further, the invasion obviously happened over a stretch. Saving Private Ryan is focused on the U.S. landings at Omaha Beach, circled in red there. And in fact, a fun little factoid here, in that second American flag that you see represented there, you see three unit insignia from the United States Army. The one in the middle there is the 29th Infantry Division. It's now an Army National Guard unit But at the time, it was an active U.S. Army division, and it took part in the landings at Omaha. You actually see them heavily represented during the movie. In fact, Private Upham, who we'll get to in a little bit, he wears that insignia, that blue and grayish white insignia on his left shoulder. You also see the insignia for the 101st Airborne there on the far left. They're obviously made famous in Band of Brothers through the exploits of Easy Company, but the titular Private Ryan is a member of the 101st Airborne. He is part of the airborne drop inland in France, and he obviously plays a key role in the film. So you see that unit logo as well. So just a little factoid as you move through. The movie centers around, arguably the central character, which is Captain James Miller. So he's of the 2nd Ranger Battalion. That's a real unit. It still exists to this day. And Captain Miller, I want you to remember, it is factually established by the members of his squad that he's been assembled at officer candidate school out of the spare parts of dead GIs. So that's factual. That's just how he came into being. So just let's all understand that. And Captain Miller is in charge of this squad. So he is in charge of a company, a larger contingent of soldiers during the actual invasion. But for the actual mission that the movie centers on, he's in charge of a handful of soldiers, and these include individuals like Private Upham, the guy that wants to initially bring a typewriter into battle. As I said, there on his left shoulder, there's the insignia of the 29th Infantry Division. So you've got Mr. Typewriter. You also have Dominic Toretto before his Fast and the Furious fame. I kid here. This is Caparzo or Vin Diesel. And also, interestingly, before he was off on the planet Pandora in Avatar, you have that greedy guy, the greedy corporate guy from Avatar, Wade. We'll talk about Wade quite a bit. And their entire mission is to rescue Jason Bourne, so from the Bourne Identity. So if you haven't seen Saving Private Ryan, just understand that the franchises of the Bourne Identity, Fast and the Furious, Avatar, all of these come smashing together for one World War II drama. So if I've thoroughly confused you now, good. All your questions will be answered once you watch the movie. But Jason Bourne is their target. So, to understand any sort of analysis before we go forward, it's important to paint the picture of what did IHL look like during 1944, during the invasion of Normandy. So IHL as a whole, what we're talking about here is the body of law, a subset of international law that operates to limit the destructive effects of armed conflict. The whole purpose of IHL is to reduce human suffering. It is a humanitarian a set of laws with the prospect of humanity at its core. It is synonymous with the law of armed conflict. It's synonymous with the law of war. So you may hear those phrases. Just understand that while they may be used in different venues, they're all talking about the same sheet of rules, as it were. So in 1944, IHL as a body of law looked very different than it does today in the 21st century. And whenever I first talk to folks about IHL that might not be experts in the area or might not be familiar, most folks are at least vaguely familiar with the Geneva Conventions. That pops into their brain, the idea of war crime. Oh, you've broken the Geneva Conventions. Reasonably, that pops into their brain. That makes sense. But understand that the Geneva Conventions, as we know them in sort of popular culture and as we know them today, what you're talking about, obviously, not just it's not just one convention. So it's actually 4 different treaties. So that's why it's plural. GCs 1 through 4. And the Geneva Conventions that we talk about today, in common parlance, those actually didn't come into being until 5 years after the invasion of Normandy, 4 years after the end of World War II in 1945. These came into being in 1949. So when Captain Miller and his squad hit the beach of Normandy, GCs 1 through 4 aren't even in existence yet. They're not even a thought. But that doesn't mean that IHL doesn't exist at all, nor does it mean that the Geneva Conventions don't exist in any form. Actually, the GCs date back to 1864. So, in the middle of the Civil War here in the United States, you have over in Europe the ratification of the very first Geneva Convention. This involved about a dozen signatory countries at the time. It was a landmark treaty and really forms the bedrock for modern IHL. And what that first Geneva Convention was concerned with was wounded on the battlefield. Up to that point, there really wasn't an internationally recognized, robust set of protections for those who fell on the battlefield and didn't die from their wounds. The world, as it were, Europe at least in 1864, came together and recognized that a lot of unnecessary suffering was happening as a result. So the 1864 First Geneva Convention is born. You would see other countries sign on to include the United States in the decades that follow. In 1906, you see an update to that Geneva Convention some 50 years later, or 40 years later. And then following World War One and the atrocities that occurred throughout that awful war, you had a number of treaties, but as far as the Geneva Conventions are concerned, in 1929, you have a new Geneva Convention, this time concerned with protections for prisoners of war, which will come back into play in just a little bit in our analysis. So understand that the GCs existed in some form before 1949. That 1949 mark really marked an accelerant and a massive evolution in IHL on the heels of World War II. You also had two seminal treaties, the Hague Conventions, both in 1899 and 1907. So two separate conventions. And these conventions are actually a series of sort of, I would call them micro agreements or smaller agreements concerning a variety of different activities, all which concern the law of land warfare. In 1907, that convention focused a little more on naval warfare as it had progressed in the intervening 8 years. But understandably, in the wake of World War One, these two conventions and really IHL as a whole, there were a lot of questions about the province of IHL. What's the point of this body of law after we just got out of the most destructive armed conflict that the world had ever seen? There were a lot of folks that reasonably questioned whether Hague, these two conventions, had any place in the overall sort of international structure. Yet Hague remained good law as far as the international community was concerned into World War II, and so its provisions were still alive and well in 1944 when troops hit the beach there. You also had another layer, an important long tent pole in the tent that is IHL of military practice or state practice. So understand that IHL as a body of law is really comprised of two main areas: treaty law, so Geneva, Hague law, like we talked about, these internationally agreed upon documents that are binding. And then you also have this unique component, which is comprised of what states do or refrain from doing during armed conflicts. Usually, these are born of just decades upon decades or conflict after conflict, in which countries are either doing or refraining from doing certain things in armed conflict because of a sense of obligation. And over time, the sort of proverbial sediment of those practices builds up. And what you have are customs that end up carrying the weight and the force of law. And so that sort of custom existed during World War II, during 1944. And a lot of times, what you'll find is that these customs end up gap filling. So places where treaties might fall short or might be silent about what you should or should not do during armed conflict, lots of times states will have filled this gap in by dictating to their own soldiers how those practices will be handled. So the U.S. Army is no different. In what you're looking at here is an image of what would have been the law of land warfare, the rules of land warfare, this field manual 27-10 at the time that soldiers had during 1944. That those rules saw a major update in 1956, and FM 27-10 continued to be updated by the Army onward into the future. So those troops weren't operating in a completely lawless environment. And what is fantastic about Saving Private Ryan, and what we'll see here when we turn to our substantive analysis, is that again and again, Saving Private Ryan is a film. Spielberg, the director, doesn't shy away from tackling these central issues. Now, he's not trotting it out as a measure of, well, did you commit a war crime or didn't you? Are you going to get in trouble for this? They approach it from the standpoint of one's morality, one's humanity. But some of the most seminal points, plot points in that film concern issues within IHL. So just understand that that's the backdrop as we go forward. And I want to take us through three different characters in the film whose arcs sort of intersect with other characters and drive the plot along. I could not start this in any place other than with Private Jackson. I actually didn't realize he had a first name that was known and sort of established until I was prepping for this webinar. It's Daniel, in case you needed to trot that out at bar trivia or something like that. So Private Daniel Jackson, my absolute favorite character other than Tom Hanks' character, Captain Miller, in the film. And Private Jackson is the squad sniper. So he's equipped with a Springfield M1903A3 rifle. This is actually an updated version of a rifle that was sort of a mainline infantry weapon of the United States Army in World War One. So this weapon has been around for a while. It's a bolt action, certainly not as fast to fire as the M1 Garand, that semi-automatic rifle that is the mainline weapon of U.S. infantry, U.S. Army infantry during World War II. He equips this weapon with two different types of scopes throughout the movie and is, a very effective soldier at his job. Fun fact here, you may never have known this or noticed this, but if you look closely throughout the film, on his hand there, on his thumb, he has a bruise, a very real bruise that the actor Barry Pepper had. This bruise has both an anchor in real life in the training for the movie, but is also actually a really neat historical accuracy, if you will. So we call that Garand thumb, that bruise right there. And actually, soldiers would get that injury that would hang around for a while. If you've ever bruised a fingernail, you know those injuries don't go away all that quickly. But the process of loading or unjamming an M1 Garand, if you know the action on that particular weapon, requires you to load in the magazine, and if a round is jammed, you're going to be sticking your thumb into the action there to try to free the jam potentially. And a lot of injuries happen. The Garand thumb got its name because it was so commonplace. You don't see Private Jackson use a Garand anywhere in the film, but it's highly likely that Barry Pepper got that injury training on the Garand in the run up to filming the entire movie. So kind of a neat behind the scenes, but also real life movie. It's perfectly plausible that Private Jackson, the character, would have gotten an injury like this, say training back in England before they deployed to Europe. So I want to tackle Jackson because he lays out this great line of thought that really got me thinking early in the movie. So as the squad is patrolling inward into France, the squad are sort of airing their grievances about having to put their lives on the line for this random private, this soldier in an ocean of soldiers in the middle of a war who they don't know, who they don't have any relationship with. They just know that they may die trying to find this guy so that he can go home. Captain Miller explains that there's a certain way to gripe and complain about things. Usually gripes go up the chain, not down the chain, as he explains. And Private Jackson offers up his perspective on this, and Captain Miller says that his perspective is the precise way to gripe if you're going to complain. But Private Jackson lays it out like this. He says that a mission like this to find Private Ryan is a serious misallocation of valuable military resources. He points out, maybe not humbly so, but that the sort of Lord himself has crafted Private Jackson into a fine instrument of warfare, and that if you were to take Jackson and put him with his 1903 rifle up to and including 1 mile of Adolf Hitler, well, the answer is pretty clear. Pack your bags, boys. The war's over, as he puts it, because he'd be able to make that shot. He's a good enough marksman with the rifle that he'd be able to take out Hitler. End the war. Everybody goes home. You get your ticker tape parade, etc. And so it got me wondering, this scene obviously doesn't play out here. You'll have to go see Inglourious Bastards for something like that, the Quentin Tarantino movie. But would Jackson's scenario here be lawful? Would assassinating Hitler be legal under IHL if Jackson got put into a position to do that? Well, to do that, let's set the table here for what assassination is. At a very, very broad level, assassination as a basic concept is a murder of a certain someone, a targeted individual, not a random killing, but a targeted individual, usually for political purposes. Layered on top of that is that typically when we think about assassinations, we think about killing that's done covertly, clandestinely. So the identity of the killer is shrouded. Maybe the country that is behind it has plausible deniability, Mission Impossible style. And that's sort of the classical concept of assassination. But understand that in practice, there's a very big difference in the treatment of assassinations during peacetime and assassinations during wartime. Whenever this topic gets brought up, it is frequently sort of trotted out by folks that, well, the United States is totally against assassinations. There's an executive order that says the U.S. doesn't participate in them, et cetera, et cetera. Understand that first of all, that the EO in question, which was signed by Gerald Ford, didn't exist, wasn't in play in 1944, but also the backdrop matters for killing, as it were, because peacetime is treated very differently than wartime. And that's because different sets of rules are in play and different actions are acceptable in one venue that would be unacceptable in another. Think about the act of one person killing another. In peacetime, that's murder usually, except in really limited circumstances, that's completely outlawed. Well, in wartime, it's a very different story. In fact, combatants are asked routinely to kill others in the course of war. That's not considered an illegal act if it's done within the bounds of IHL. And so the general rule that we operate on is that enemy combatants are going to be valid targets at all times during wartime. Well, that starts to color this basic broad definition of assassination. Well, because you can have some killings that are lawful. IHL, understand, is not a body of law that operates as a light switch. It doesn't purport to outlaw all killing. It doesn't purport to prevent all death and suffering. If it did, if that was its aims, it wouldn't have survived past 1864 or 1865 because it wouldn't be practical. No country would look at a body of law like that and regard it with any degree of seriousness because that just doesn't match up with the realities of war. People die, things are destroyed and damaged in wartime. That's just a reality. Some things are necessary like that. And this general rule stems from that necessity. So when we're talking about wartime assassination, understand that now the aperture has been dialed in. Now we're not talking about just any murder that could happen, but a specific subset. And actually, the FM 27-10, that state practice, that military practice that I referenced earlier in setting this scene, it actually sketches out the scope of what is considered assassination within the bounds of war. And it starts out by saying that assassinations are not to be performed, that they are outlawed. But it clearly defines or narrowly defines what assassination is. So we get three sort of concrete examples. Outlawry, so that's the business of declaring that someone can be killed no matter the circumstances. So I don't care if he surrenders, I don't care if he's wounded grievously. This person is going to be killed and outright. Putting a bounty on someone's head or offering a dead or alive reward. So these last two are sort of tied at the hip. You start to see a common thread through these. These aren't just any old killing of a combatant. These have a through line, and that through line is that there's a certain amount of treachery involved. So these three I would put into the bucket of what we call treacherous killing. This concept ropes in another IHL concept known as perfidy. So treachery as a term of legal art isn't defined in IHL. Thank the lawyers for that one later. But the basic concept is that certain actions are beyond the pale, that warfare is destructive as it is, as much death and injury as it naturally inflicts on others, that there are certain things that are beyond the pale for a professional army, for an army that still has an anchor in humanity. And so, the business of perfidy are those actions that go beyond it, that think about it in terms of an action that would turn your nose up as a respectable soldier. This idea that extends back into the time of knights, of the chivalry of war, right? There are certain things that are just wrong, that soldiers just don't do. And so treacherous killing, so these actions all kind of fall into that category of things that just don't pass the smell test. The U.S. Army looks at things like slapping a bounty on someone's head and says, that might be effective on some level, but that's not something that we're going to condone our soldiers to do. We're not going to condone killing an individual under any circumstances based on a declaration by a commander or something like that. So it carves out what I regard as a pretty narrow set of circumstances that set that sandbox boundary for what an assassination is. So let's bring it back to Private Jackson and Adolf Hitler. And the question is, it's a war, right? World War II, obviously. Is this a lawful killing, or is it an assassination if Jackson had the opportunity to do this? Well, understand Hitler's not just your regular old elected representative, right? Hitler, if you know really anything about World War II history, is that he was intrinsically involved in the military efforts of the Nazis, right? I won't even begin to attempt to pronounce his German title, but it roughly translates to Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces. And Adolf Hitler was notorious for being involved to a point of fault at times in the strategic and sometimes even the tactical decision-making levels of the German armed forces, to the point of sometimes just overruling his own generals. Hitler himself was a combat veteran from World War One. He liked to fashion himself a military strategist and leader. Set aside the fact that he was very low ranking during World War One, but he had a very, very steeped role in the operation of the German armed forces. He fits the definition as much as he is a sort of a high-level military commander, despite being a civilian in base terms. He is an enemy combatant. He is taking a direct part in hostilities actively, even if he's not on the ground pulling the trigger of a German weapon. He is as much a leader of the German war effort as Rommel or any of his other generals. And so that starts to very much transition the thought process, because this isn't the targeted killing of some random German citizen that happens to occupy an elected office. This is now the targeted killing of a high-level enemy combatant. And so for Jackson, there's a good reason why he makes this basic assumption that, hey, if you put me in range of Hitler, if I kill him, it's over. It's not because, hey, we lost our elected leader, that's it. It's because he recognizes, even as a young private, an inexperienced private, the strategic and tactical value that a combatant like Hitler had to the German armed forces. So this doesn't fit into any of the buckets of treachery, as it were. Not just because he's an enemy combatant, but because the scenario in which Jackson is sort of fantasizing about here isn't treacherous. It doesn't constitute perfidy. Jackson's not waltzing in, pretending to be a civilian and attempting to use that status to trick Hitler and kill him. He's not, faking a surrender. He, at a distance, is firing a rifle and killing an enemy combatant. And even though a certain amount of sort of clandestineness, if that's a word, is necessary for a sniper to operate, that doesn't turn something into treacherous killing. It doesn't equate to perfidy. If it did, military snipers just wouldn't exist in militaries around the world. And so, what Jackson is fantasizing about here, perfectly lawful if he got the chance to do it. Again, go watch Inglorious Bastards if you want an example of how that might play out. So our next character that we're going to focus in on is Technician Fourth Grade Irwin Wade. Again, they refer to him as Wade. So if you're just learning now that he was a Technician Fourth Grade or that his first name was Irwin, welcome to my club. And as a fun fact here, the United States Army doesn't use these technician grades anymore. It was replaced decades later with a rank we now call specialist. Specialist in the modern U.S. Army doesn't denote specialized training, or a medic can hold a specialist, or a trained engineer, soldier, or something like that. But during World War II, the Army rolled these ranks in as sort of a corollary to what the Navy has always done in recognizing specialized skill sets of some sailors. And they attempted to do that with certain soldiers. So Wade, as a trained medic, would have had that skill set. There were actually 7 grades of technician, with 1 being sort of the highest, most senior grade, 7 being the lowest. So Wade would have found himself right about in the middle. They would have been referred to as sergeants at this 4th grade level. But understand, if you're familiar at all with the Army rank structure, a sergeant, that's a non-commissioned officer. They are typically in charge or tasked with leading some level of troops. A technician 4th grade might have been referred to as sergeant. They would have had the authority of a private, so a lower ranking soldier. So just an interesting World War II twist there, and sort of a specter of the Army's past. So we get to see Wade in action. I apologize for not prefacing that scene and the little bit of gore there before I played it. We get to see Wade and other medics in action within the first few minutes of the movie during the invasion of Normandy, there on the beach on D-Day. And I've always been fascinated with Wade as a character. He plays such a central role in the film, and he's such a central sort of supporting character to the lifeblood of the squad. He's also a really, really great teaching lens for understanding medical personnel and combat medics. So let's talk about Wade and his role. Understand that combat medics are not the same as other uniformed soldiers. They're actually treated as non-combatants, which is a little bit paradoxical when you think about it at baseline. So a non-combatant is basically defined as someone who does not take a direct part in hostilities. Non-combatants obviously come in different walks of life. You also see a chaplain performing their chaplain duty, their religious duties on the beach there in Normandy, a priest giving last rites during the landing scene. Uh, but what's key here is that last phrase. They don't take a direct part in hostilities. Understandably, and this is where confusion often comes in, direct part in hostilities doesn't mean that they take no part whatsoever in hostilities. In fact, we see right in the outset of this film, they are right in the thick of it. Wade and his fellow medics are definitionally in the middle of the fight. A medic would be of little use if they weren't. But that direct qualifier is a really key word there, and we're going to expand on that and why it's important for medics. So you're not going to find the term combat medics anywhere in IHL. The operative term is medical personnel, and I say operative because it's going to either qualify or not qualify someone for a special level of protection that's really critical to their job duties. So, medical personnel are those who are exclusively assigned to medical duties. That first word is not highlighted in red, but it's critically important. Exclusive is a really key qualifier because, understandably, soldiers across the board are often trained in medical tasks. To this day, the U.S. Army still trains its soldiers in basic first aid. We carry basic individual first aid kits. In fact, you see the other soldiers in the squad, not just with that kind of equipment that they carry around, things like bandages, morphine, etc. But you also see them with the training and the know-how to at least render basic first aid. We'll come back around to it, but Wade is the recipient of some of that first aid later in the film. But the difference is that while other soldiers may intermittently do that as in the course of their other duties, a medical personnel is exclusively doing medical duties. We'll break that down a little bit more. So we see right away that sort of the classical anchor point for what is a medical duty is the business of medical treatment. So the business of tending to a wound, diagnosing a wound, that sort of thing. You see the soldiers there or the medics there tending to a grievously wounded soldier. Just a few minutes later, you see triage happening. So Wade, his back, the back of his head is to us in this shot. He's working with a battalion surgeon there on the right. They're going down the line triaging. So it's interesting if you go back and watch that opening scene. That battlefield surgeon is helping him evaluate casualties on the fly. They mark one as expectant, meaning this person is going to die and should be treated only with morphine to comfort them. They treat another or mark another as routine, another is priority, so different levels of treatment. So that's another part of their duties, being able to scale and prioritize their treatment. Another interesting component that really gets, if you blink, you will miss it, the impartial rendering of aid. So a medic in practice is obliged by IHL to impartially render medical aid based upon the need, not the party affiliation. So by that I mean you don't get to triage soldiers because, hey, I'm going to take care of my own soldiers first and then the enemy second. It's got to be done impartially based on the severity of the injuries. And there's a scene during the first act where the squad accidentally stumbles upon a squad of German soldiers. There's this wall that gets knocked down. Actually, it's Paul Giamatti. His character sits down, and the two squads are just shouting at each other, one in German, the other in English, and then another squad of 101st soldiers opens fire, kills the Germans. And as the soldiers are moving in to where the Germans were, you actually see Wade. Here's a screenshot of it. He actually tends to one of the German soldiers who is wounded. He's not dead yet. They don't focus on Wade, but what he's doing there is rendering impartial aid. He's not there stripping intelligence. He's not there trying to relieve this soldier of weapons and ammo or do something that's not related to medical treatment. He's trying to determine whether this soldier needs medical aid. So again, this is something that you don't see throughout the film, but is a really important component of Wade's duties. Another blink and you'll miss it moment. Actually, I didn't realize this until I was an adult watching this film. my dad originally took me to see Saving Private Ryan when I was 13. That's a whole other conversation about what seeing this on the big screen does as a teenager. He tried to talk me out of ordering popcorn. I didn't listen to him, and that was a mistake. But you don't see Wade carrying a weapon at any point in this film. And so understand that the qualifier here is that medics do not take a direct part in hostilities. So you don't see him offensively engaging in combat actions. There is no rule against a medic carrying small arms. Understand that it is perfectly lawful for a medic, medical personnel of any type, to carry a weapon and to use it in self-defense. They can be escorted by other soldiers, like the squad here in Saving Private Ryan, and that doesn't violate their status as a medical personnel. But interestingly here, you blink and you miss it, but if you notice, everybody else is carrying a weapon, a Garand, a BAR, a Thompson. He's holding the straps of his rucksack there. So you see him doing that. There's another famous World War II medic movie, Hacksaw Ridge, involving Desmond Doss. Desmond Doss, a very famous World War II medic. He also doesn't carry a weapon in combat. Just understand that that's not a requirement. But what all of these things do that you see in these flashes throughout the film, these are the critical qualifiers for someone to be considered medical personnel under IHL. So I bring this up because again and again you get these like flash sequences that you might have blinked and missed, but they're really critical to establishing who Wade is and his role legally on the battlefield. And so that's critical because combat medics, they're not medical personnel just for no good reason. That qualifier exists because they are protected from direct attack. That means, and the reason that I've highlighted it there for you is that not that a medic can't be killed under any circumstances. Goodness knows that we see that happen repeatedly in this film, but they can't be intentionally targeted. Their protection as medical personnel it's not sort of done in a vacuum. It exists, it was created as an extension of the protections that were developed for wounded soldiers on the battlefield. There was this recognition, again, going back to the 1860s, that for too long, those wounded on the battlefield unnecessarily suffered because there was no legal protection for them to get the care that they needed. And there's a recognition that in order for those individuals to be cared for and therefore reduce their suffering, you needed personnel who were able to provide medical care and not be intentionally shot while doing it. And so you get this sort of robust set of protections for medical personnel that gets born out of this desire to reduce the suffering for the wounded on the battlefield. And it's a necessity that those medical personnel have that proverbial shield. Understand it's not impenetrable. Soldiers can get shot, and goodness knows if we go back and watch that clip, you see bullets flying all around them. There's nothing in IHL that says that, hey, an errant artillery round or a mortar round or strafing fire or something like that can't kill a medic, or that would be a war crime. What we're trying to prevent here, what IHL is trying to prevent, are those intentional killings. And they actually wear very intentionally the Red Cross symbol to help assist in that process. So you'll see throughout the film, Wade and his fellow medics wear the Red Cross emblem on the white background, as well as the same emblem on an armband to denote their status as medical personnel. That emblem was developed within the First Geneva Convention as a proverbial visual shield. That symbol isn't to indicate first aid or band-aids or hey, you can get care here. That is a literal symbol that says, do not shoot me. It's a symbol that was chosen because of the ease of recognition for both enemy troops and friendly troops. A friendly troop can look and say, that person is assigned to medical duties, even if they're an enemy, and I can expect to get care from them legally. For the enemy, that assists their decision making in their obligation to distinguish between combatants, so normal soldiers, and non-combatants like these medical personnel. Modern medics don't wear that as much, and obviously the respect or the lack thereof for the emblem is an ongoing issue, and was even during World War II. But we'll come back to this concept of direct attack in just a moment because it'll be pertinent for another story line. We see Wade meet just a really heart-wrenching end during a scene, probably the most poignant, moving scene in the entire film. The squad attacks a German machine gun nest that had recently killed a number of 82nd Airborne soldiers on patrol. And Wade is hit in the stomach by machine gun fire. Purposefully, you don't see the scene play out through the eyes of the soldiers who are on the assault force. Private Upham, Mr. Typewriter, is left behind with the gear and extra ammo, and you view the chaos of this skirmish through his eyes, through the eyes of the spotting scope that he uses during that battle. And so you can't really make out everything that occurs. There's gunfire, there's explosions, yelling, etc. And by the time he makes it up to the battle, when he's called up with supplies, he stumbles upon Wade in this state. And so I bring this up for two reasons. One, we don't know for certain whether his killing was intentional. We'll come back to that during our next character analysis. Two, the rest of the squad gets immediately involved in the rendering of first aid in an attempt to save Wade's life. Wade is actually directly involved. He's trying to diagnose himself. He ultimately, in one of the most tear-jerking moments in film history, realizes that he's going to die and tells or instructs his squad mates to give him repeated sticks of morphine. The understated point here is that they're going to overdose him on morphine here. Understand that that's a real example, a real film example of other soldiers who are performing medical duties, but that's not their exclusive duty. When Caparzo, so Vin Diesel's character, or Jackson or Captain Miller even, when they're sitting there trying to bandage his wounds or stop the bleeding, those are medical duties, but it is not their exclusive duty. So they don't qualify for protection as medical personnel. Now, Wade, as a wounded soldier who's out of the fight, would enjoy protection based on a different component of IHL. But we'll come back to this, the directness or the lack thereof momentarily. So that brings us to Private Steamboat Willie. And I use Steamboat Willie because that's his credited name. They never give the name of this German soldier. Steamboat Willie is a member of the German machine gun crew who kept Miller in his squad attack. And he's the only surviving member of that crew. And we'll see here in a scene sort of what transpires after the machine gun nest is knocked out.
Not yet. First, make a mark and cover Wade's body for grave detail. Same thing for those paratroopers down there. Strip that stuff off and check them for intelligence.
Ask this piece of shit if he's the one who shot Wade. Ask him!
Doesn't matter.
Yeah, it does matter.
Was du ein Maschinengewehr?
Nein, ich hab nachgeladen. Ich hab nicht geschossen. Ich hab nicht...
Shut up with that filthy piglet. Jackson, you're hit.
Ich hab nicht geschossen. Ich hab das gemacht. Du bist deutsch. Wie heißt du?
This is just in the arm, sir. Get it clean, dressed. You and Sarge watch the perimeters.
Bitte tötet mich nicht. Bitte tötet mich nicht. Ich will mich ergeben.
Please don't shoot. He
I don't
wants
care
to
what he says, Owen.
Sir, are you gonna let them kill him?
This is not right.
You can help me with the bodies.
What is happening?
So this may be one of the most impactful scenes in the entire film, and I say that recognizing that the entire movie is truly impactful from start to finish. But this scene goes back to what I said at the outset. Very consciously, Spielberg, as the director, again and again comes back to these themes rooted in IHL, but explored through the lens of humanity and morality. And Steamboat Willie's experience here with Captain Miller's squad is a fantastic example of the intersection of the two. And at base, I want to get to the business of uh, the squad's desire to kill Steamboat Willie. But as a starting point, let's consider whether he's a prisoner of war. So you hear Upham mention that he's surrendered. He's not talking in terms of IHL, but it's worth it to look at this as a baseline consideration. So under IHL and under the Geneva Convention of 1929, that POW focused convention, a combatant is one, or excuse me, a POW is a combatant who falls into the hands of an adversary during an international armed conflict. Suffice it to say, World War II is a classic example of an international armed conflict, just country versus country. And that definition is fairly wide. It encompasses a lot of different ways in which a combatant could come into control, as it were, of an adversary. Surrendering is one classic way, also just getting captured. So being the last man standing, being outnumbered, and having your weapon taken away. We don't see what happened, how things happened to Steamboat Willie. Upham suggests that he just surrendered. In either case, he meets the definition of a prisoner of war. And so, as a baseline, after he's surrendered, his status under IHL changes. What was just a moment ago a German soldier aggressively defending a position with a lethal weapon, now his legal status is changed, and the basic rule, even under the 1929 convention, which had far less robust suite of protections than the eventual Geneva Convention 3, the sort of revised POW Convention of 1949. POWs have to be treated humanely. They can't be executed. They can't be subjected to injury, humiliation, that sort of thing. That protection was born out of the atrocities seen during World War One, committed against POWs on both sides of that conflict. And so that's the sort of base level switch in status that can happen in an instant. And understand, before we get into the business of retaliation, that switch that switch in legal status triggers a set of legal obligations on the part of the capturing force. And the mere argument that it is not practical, it's not feasible to keep someone prisoner or escort them along. That is an undercurrent in the squad's sort of mentality toward Steamboat Willie here. Hey, we've got a mission to do. We're not going to be able to find Private Miller or Private Ryan rather if we've got this German soldier that we have to lug along. Uh, it's not an excuse to go beyond what IHL allows for. In fact, at a different point during 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, so later this very same year, you had an instance of this sort of thing on the other side of the conflict, in which an SS officer, an SS commander, uh, captured a number about 70 to 85 U.S. soldiers during the Battle of the Bulge, during the latter part of that battle. As German lines broke and as German forces retreated, the SS officer made the decision that the POWs had to be executed right there in the snow because they couldn't feasibly keep them and escort them to where they were retreating to. He was tried at Nuremberg. That defense was rejected soundly. The idea that it was a military necessity to violate IHL, and the basic tenet coming out of that case is that military necessity cannot be used as a justification to do something that's otherwise unlawful under IHL. So necessity aside, the real undercurrent here in this scene is retaliation. And go back, we just watched the scene, but go back to the moment in which there's discussion being had. Think about the way that the camera is oriented on the soldiers there. It's not face on with a tight shot of the soldiers as they speak. The camera is positioned behind the still smoking German machine gun, that MG42 that's sitting on the sandbags. It is a sort of proverbial like manifestation of this, like the tempers that are still raw in the immediate aftermath, not just of a really intense firefight, but in the immediate aftermath of the death of a beloved and very valued member of the squad. This happens right after Wade has passed away, right in front of everyone as they try to save his life. And there is a palpable sense of anger, understandably, running through the squad. And so the legal question is, can they retaliate against this German soldier for what's transpired here? And I mentioned that we would come back to Wade's death, and I want to bring it back to that, not just because of the timing, but because of the question of how Wade's death may have happened. We don't see it, but understand that before we get into picking that apart, that there is a concept called reprisals under IHL. And the basic concept of a reprisal is that an action that would normally be illegal, a violation of IHL, so something that's normally unlawful in war, can be considered lawful or legal if it's done in response to an enemy's IHL violation. So that's what a reprisal is. And it begs the question, was there a violation of IHL that immediately preceded the squad's desire to kill Steamboat Willie? And I ask that because we go back, how did we see that firefight transpire? Well, it was at a distance through a scope from someone who was not directly participating in it. So we don't know for sure whether Wade was intentionally targeted. We do know that he's the only member of the squad that was directly hit. He was hit square in the stomach with several machine gun rounds. The only other member of the squad that was injured in any way, as you saw, was Private Jackson, the sniper. He had a small graze wound on his shoulder, a pretty minor wound that he didn't even realize he had. So I don't think it's a stretch to say that Wade may have been intentionally targeted by that machine gun crew. They certainly would have known his role and his importance to the squad wearing that Red Cross marking. Certainly the squad on some level uh, may think that because the first question that they ask or they ask Upham to ask Steamboat Willie is whether he's the one that killed Wade. A reasonable inference is that you killed our medic, you violated IHL in a very serious way. So does Wade's killing, let's assume that it was intentional, that it was in fact an IHL violation, does it warrant a reprisal under these circumstances? Well, understand that even though this concept exists and that there's a certain carve out for unlawful actions to be considered lawful, that carve out is really limited by IHL. That's understandable because a carve out like this can quickly turn from a narrow exception into a slippery slope if you don't put very tight guardrails on when it's allowed to take place. Uh, if any old IHL violation is justification for reprisal, reprisals become the rule and not the exception, the extreme exception, as they're intended to be. IHL treats reprisals as a veritable last resort action to take in armed conflict. And the purpose of a reprisal is not to just respond in kind to an IHL violation, but it has to be to end the enemy's IHL violations or violation. So you see there that that's a fairly narrow bracket. Now, it doesn't define the exact circumstances in which that would be acceptable, but in the context of Wade's death, a an individual killing of a medic, so a singular violation of IHL, even though egregious, even though serious, arguably wouldn't warrant a reprisal under those terms because sure, on some level, killing Steamboat Willie will make, I guess, to some degree, sure, other medics don't get killed if he was the one that in fact killed them. But there's no lesson. This isn't communicated anywhere else in the German army. Nobody, no German patrol is going to walk upon this and have any understanding or knowledge that this was a reprisal, that this happened because of the killing of a medic. It would achieve none of the effects of what a reprisal is there as a carve out in IHL 4. Moreover, IHL further restricts reprisals because you can't do them against certain individuals. POWs, prisoners of war, are a protected class of individual whom you cannot reprise against. And that was the case even coming out of the 1929 POW convention. This was a direct result of the experience of POWs during World War I, who were repeatedly reprised against for a range of reasons, ranging from we're just upset that this was an awful battle and we suffered awful casualties and we want to take a measure of revenge, to hey, you used poison gas on us and we captured you now. That was an awful thing to do and a violation of that, in that case, the Hague regulations. So we're going to reprise against you. Understandably, those POWs are in a very, very different position than other other soldiers. They're not even combatants at that point because they're out of the fight. So even in the 1929 convention, you had to carve out protecting POWs. And understand as well that nowhere in a reprisal is there a justification to do that because something bad, not illegal, but something bad was done to you. So we lost a dear friend, we lost a critical member of our squad, our medic, or whoever. We're just really angry and upset. None of those are trigger points for reprisals. And so the way that this scene plays out, if you've watched it, involves Captain Miller as Upham repeatedly pleads. He decides to blindfold Steamboat Willie. He tells him to take 100, 200, 300 paces, count off, and turn himself in to the next patrol. And I go back to the necessity piece that I mentioned earlier because there's an argument from one of the squad members that, hey, if we release this guy, he's just going to get recycled into German service and fight against U.S. forces, Allied forces at some other point. And again, necessity or even that likelihood or certainty is not an acceptable trigger for an otherwise unlawful act. We see this get brought full circle at the end of the movie. So during the assault on the town of Ramel, not only do you see Steamboat Willie recycled right back into German service fighting, but he actually fatally wounds Captain Miller on the bridge that they're defending. There's a quick scene in which Captain Miller is seen at a distance coming up over the bridge, and Steamboat Willie puts a fatal shot into his abdomen and keeps him. Doesn't even recognize who Captain Miller is. Just shoots him. That ends up being the shot that takes his life. Upham later captures, as you see here, Steamboat Willie and several other German soldiers, and ends up executing Steamboat Willie before telling the rest of the Germans to get out of there. So you see this really moving sequence come full circle in which IHL violation, sure, yeah, obviously on Upham's part, but this is rooted in this sense of morality. Upham goes from this really sort of naive private whose job it is to make maps and translate things to seeing the horrors of war up front and the sort of loss of humanity. And he struggles to come to grips with that in this scene, and so it's just a really moving full circle moment, and one that has IHL as a backstop.org. On behalf of our entire IHL dissemination program and the American Red Cross, thanks for coming out. I hope I've given you, not that you needed another reason to go watch it, but a reason to go watch Saving Private Ryan again. I'm going to go watch it again, even though I watched it in prep for this. I hope I've also given you some food for thought. Maybe you'll see some other issues along the way. That movie is certainly stock and chock full of them. But thank you for attending. We hope to see you next time.